That night, my stepfather charged at me and struck me, breaking a bone and dislocating my shoulder. My mother stayed silent. Moments later, he grabbed a shard of broken whiskey bottle, staggered forward, and lunged at me, yelling, "You think you're better than me?" And my mother, the same woman who had defended him for 20 years, trembled, and for the first time, shouted back, "Enough!" But he didn't stop until we heard the sirens wailing and the police burst through the door. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask, where are you watching this video from? And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe that a woman shouldn't have to suffer just to be considered kind, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about a stepfather. It's about every system that taught us to shrink ourselves to keep the peace. I am Natalie Carter, 28 years old, head of business development at one of the largest real estate firms in downtown Los Angeles. My apartment in Pasadena is under renovation, so I decided to stay temporarily at my mother and stepfather's house in San Marino, just a 30-minute drive away. When my mother, Margaret, called and asked me to come stay for a few months, her voice trembled. "I miss you. It's been a while since we've had dinner together." At the time, I thought maybe this was a chance to reconnect after years of distance. I didn't expect that those short 3 months would change my life, in ways I couldn't foresee. Every morning at the office, I am the Natalie people admire, confident, decisive, sharp in closing real estate deals. But each evening, back at the house in San Marino, I felt like a 16-year-old girl again, watched closely by my stepfather with every glance, every sigh. Richard Hale, CEO of a prestigious real estate firm, the man my mother remarried when I was 12, after my biological father died of cancer. In the early days, he was attentive, even taking me to company picnics like a devoted father. But over the years, Richard revealed his controlling and volatile nature. I remember the times he forced my mother to change meals just because it wasn't to his taste, or forbade me from wearing jeans out because they looked unprofessional. At 18, I left for college determined to be independent, refusing any financial support from him. I built my career in Pasadena, bought my own home, earned my colleagues' respect, and thought I had escaped his shadow. But my mother stayed behind, always finding ways to defend him. He provides financial security, a sense of stability, and me, helpless. Returning to San Marino, the familiar air once again pressed down, the cold stares, the slow-dripping sarcasm at every meal. Once, I had just walked into the kitchen and saw Richard reading company emails on his iPad. Without looking up, he said flatly, "I don't like employees who overstep." He didn't name me, but the tension in the room made my mother quietly pour coffee while I clenched my fists. I knew he saw me as a threat, not just because I was his wife's stepdaughter, but because I was a standout head of sales, gradually catching the attention of the board. The bitter truth was, in business, Richard was also my indirect superior. I couldn't push back too hard. Even the smallest misstep could be labeled as disrespecting leadership. I was both an employee and a daughter being watched in her own mother's home. The line between work and family blurred, and I was trapped in the middle. Then, one Friday night at dinner, Richard loudly praised a luxury expansion plan in Beverly Hills. I gently countered that the middle class in Pasadena and Riverside was the real emerging market, citing reports I had worked on. Richard slammed his wine glass on the table, eyes red. "Don't try to school a man with 30 years in real estate." My mother rushed to intervene, and I stayed silent. But that night, I began quietly collecting data, not just for the company, but for my own survival. And everything truly exploded at the annual meeting at the Waldorf Astoria, where I stood up and challenged Richard's strategy in front of the entire board. But before I tell you what happened in that room, I want you to understand that this act of defiance was not just about business. It was the last drop in a decades-long journey of psychological control and emotional violence. Because silence is sometimes complicity, and I had chosen silence no longer. On the first day moving back to San Marino, I arrived just before 7 a.m., still in the same suit from the previous night's late meeting. My mother opened the door with a strained smile, her apron still smelling of eggs and coffee. I was about to ask if breakfast was still available when I heard the steady tapping from the dining room. Richard's fingernail hitting the oak table as he read emails. Morning light streamed through the glass window, casting every crease on his frowning face into sharp relief. On his iPad screen, I caught a glimpse of the subject line, "Quarterly Business Report, sent by Natalie's team." I hadn't even sat down when he coldly said, eyes still fixed on the screen, "I don't like employees who overstep." No one said a word. My mother quietly placed a black coffee in front of him and turned away. The kitchen was clean to the point of sterility. I gently set down my bag, hand still gripping the strap. On the table, a copy of the Los Angeles Business Times lay neatly folded open to the page covering the Sustainable Development Project in Pasadena, the project I led. The article had my name on it. I knew he had read it, and he didn't like it. A few hours later, I drove to the Pasadena branch office. Vanessa, my closest colleague, handed me an iced coffee, her eyes perceptive. "Stayed over in San Marino again?" I gave a half smile. "Just for now," I replied. She didn't press, but placed a hand on my shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. I knew she understood. In real estate, Richard Hale holds considerable sway, not just with the media, but within the company itself, and he has never liked anyone threatening that position. That evening, when I returned home, my mother was preparing dinner. The scent of oregano wafted from the kitchen. A familiar smell from my childhood. But the space no longer felt like a home. It resembled a film set, carefully staged, directed by Richard. Dinner was always at 6 p.m. sharp, the table set, wine poured before any food appeared. Richard always sat at the head. I was always seated slightly to the left, across from my mother, as if every move I made was to remain within his line of sight. Mid-meal, Richard suddenly asked, "What do you think about women's roles in this industry?" I slowly chewed my salad. "I think capability has nothing to do with gender." He scoffed. "Really? I think women are better suited for support roles. Assistants, PR, decorating. But don't dream of leadership." My mother said nothing. Neither did I. But inside, something cracked. Not because of his words, but because of my mother's look. She didn't object. She just kept slicing bread, as if she had learned how to survive, in silence. That night, I sat on the second-floor balcony, looking down at the perfectly trimmed garden. Each Japanese bonsai placed meticulously like pieces in a power map of this house. I wondered, if I had stayed here at 18, would I have become like my mother? Polite, obedient, trading freedom for the illusion of stability? I didn't know. But I did know this. If I kept enduring, I would lose the one thing I had fought hardest to protect: my voice. 3 weeks after returning to San Marino, I closed one of the most important deals of the quarter, a sustainable housing project in South Pasadena. It wasn't a billion-dollar transaction, but it was strategic. My team and I had spent 6 months surveying demand, focusing on the young middle class, people being priced out of the market due to skyrocketing luxury real estate. Behavioral maps, demographic data, feedback from over 500 households. All pointed to one conclusion. If the company wanted to retain market share in the next 3 years, it needed to restructure the mid-tier segment. After the signing, I returned to the office. My team stood and applauded, and Vanessa, my closest colleague since day one, handed me a small wine bottle with a red ribbon. "Congrats! You're the only one brave enough to challenge that outdated strategy." Then she tilted her head. "But be careful. Richard doesn't like anyone stealing the spotlight." I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I knew she was right. That same afternoon, I saw Richard's personal assistant leaving the chairman's office, a rarely frequented upper-floor space. I knew he was lobbying for a new project, probably the luxury housing chain in Beverly Hills he'd bragged about at dinner. Lavish renderings, private gyms, rooftop helipads. Things that didn't belong to most Californians still struggling to make mortgage payments. Around that time, I quietly began documenting the weaknesses of this strategy, not out of defiance, but through data. Every day after work, I went to the city library, borrowing regional planning reports, studying homebuyer behavior in Glendale, Riverside, Pomona, markets on the rise but ignored by leadership for being not glamorous. I spoke less during executive meetings but observed more. Every glance at Richard, every reluctant nod when he pitched his ideas. I took note of them all. And I began piecing together the full market picture, not just to persuade him, but to prepare for confrontation. That night, when I came home, my mother was reading in the living room. I sat beside her, saying nothing. After a moment, she gently asked, "Are you all right?" I nodded, but inside I knew. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to retreat. I was caught between two worlds. One, the job I loved, where I earned respect through real effort. The other, a luxurious house in San Marino, where every word felt like a test. But I also knew one thing clearly. If I wanted to live truthfully, I couldn't stay silent forever. I had to speak up, and this time, I wouldn't wait for permission. Saturday dinner unfolded as usual, the table meticulously set, wine poured in advance, the ceiling lights reflecting off the polished walnut surface as if everything in this house had been calculated to perfection. I took my usual seat to Richard's left. My mother sat across from me. We had barely taken a few bites when he set his wine glass down, his voice smug. "Next week, I'll be announcing the expansion plan for our high-end housing chain in Beverly Hills. A private compound for the ultra-wealthy, complete with a spa center and Japanese-style hanging gardens. It's a big investment, but people like that will pay for exclusivity." I put down my knife, dabbed my mouth with a cloth napkin, then replied, calmly, but with each word clear and firm. "I think the current market doesn't support that direction. Last quarter's data shows demand is shifting toward the mid-range segment in Pasadena and Riverside. If we invest correctly, we could build a more sustainable client base." The air seemed to freeze. Richard looked up at me. His eyes were like cracked glass, clear but razor-sharp. He laughed, without a shred of warmth. "Data? Are you pulling out numbers to teach me how to do real estate?" I was about to respond, but he lifted his wine glass, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Let me remind you, I've been in this industry for 30 years. When you were still riding a bike to school, I was closing deals to buy whole blocks in Brentwood." My mother flinched, setting her spoon down. "Richard, come on, it's just a different perspective." But he snapped, "Shut up, Margaret, you're always taking her side." That sentence chilled the entire room like a sudden draft. I looked at my mother. She bowed her head, hands resting on the napkin, not daring to look up. I swallowed my anger, not because I feared him, but because I felt tired. Tired of staying silent to spare my mother discomfort. Tired of being a grown woman still forced to live like a child in what was supposed to be a home. I stood up, cleared my plate. As I passed him, I said just one sentence, soft as a breeze, sharp as a blade. "I don't need your approval, but I will prove I'm right." He didn't respond, but I clearly heard the sound of the wine glass being slammed back onto the table, echoing like a challenge. And I knew, from that moment on, every line had been crossed. This was no longer a family dinner dispute. It was a battle between two generations of leadership, and I was not backing down. I began long silent nights, not to endure, but to prepare. After that dinner, I stopped arguing. I still came home on time, still ate with the family, still nodded at Richard's remarks as if they didn't touch me. But each night, after my mother went upstairs, I sat in front of my laptop, the blue glow of the screen lighting up a face deep in calculation. I reopened every survey I had collected, from Pasadena, Riverside, to Glendale, places I believed represented the new consumer trend. I didn't just look at numbers. I went deeper. I reconnected with people who had participated in the surveys, interviewed them over Zoom, asked permission to record, to capture their voices, their faces, their emotions. "I want a house near schools, with a small yard. I don't need a home theater," said a single mother in Riverside. "I don't need a 3-story penthouse. I need somewhere stable to raise my 2 kids." These words, every syllable, became living evidence against the outdated mindset Richard clung to, a mindset that built for the wealthiest 1% and ignored everyone else. I printed demographic maps, highlighted red zones where the mid-range market was growing but untapped. I recorded every internal meeting where Richard repeated phrases like positioning for elite clientele, the ultra-wealthy need exclusivity. If you can't afford it, you're not our target. I saved everything onto a secret USB, locked in a small safe in Vanessa's office, the only person I trusted. One evening, I handed her my first detailed report. Vanessa read it in silence for a long time. Then she looked up, voice low but steady. "If you choose to speak out, you need to be sure you won't look back. This isn't a debate anymore. It's an exposé." I nodded. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear of losing my job, but because I knew I was about to enter a place where I would no longer be a daughter or a subordinate. I was about to face the man who had controlled my mother for 20 years, and there was no room for ambiguity. Next week, at the Waldorf Astoria Beverly Hills, the annual board meeting would take place, with the entire executive board in attendance. I had requested the right to present an independent report, bypassing Richard. The board secretary, who secretly sided with me, confirmed the schedule. After hanging up, I stared out the window, where the city lights of Los Angeles flickered like a warning. I knew. This wasn't just a report. This was a revolution. And I was ready to strike the match. The conference room on the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria Beverly Hills looked like a stage designed for silent confrontations. The crystal chandelier reflected across the glossy black ebony oval table, each chair etched with a brass nameplate for board members. I entered right on time, in a charcoal-cut suit, hair in a low bun, leather portfolio in hand. No shaking, no stumbles. Richard was already there. He stood beside the projector screen, chatting with Thomas Nguyen, the board chairman, with a confident smile, as if the entire room had been scripted to his liking. As I walked past, he gave me a brief glance, short enough to avoid attention, long enough to say, "I know. And I don't think you'll dare." The meeting opened with greetings from the chairman. Richard was invited to present first. He stood upright, voice heavy with conviction, each word forged from 30 years of experience. He painted a grand vision of ultra-luxury housing, emphasizing profit potential, brand elevation, and claimed, "This is the strategic move needed to position the company at the industry's top tier." Board members nodded, some took notes, no one objected. The presentation ended with a light, polite round of applause, a ceremonial gesture. Richard sat down, confidently poured himself some water, turned toward me, smiling. But when Thomas spoke, "We have a special edition. Natalie Carter, head of market development, has a supplementary proposal." The smile faded. I stood. The room turned to me. 1 second of silence, compressing every breath. I opened my portfolio, took out the USB and plugged it in. The screen lit up with a map of Pasadena, housing demand movement over the past 3 years. I began speaking, not in strategic jargon, but through real stories, real needs, real dreams. Over the past 6 months, my team and I have gathered data from more than 1,200 families across Pasadena, Riverside, Pomona, Glendale. 73% said they couldn't afford a home because prices exceeded loan capacities. but 68% of those would purchase immediately if homes matched mid to upper middle incomes and had energy-saving designs. This isn't speculation, it's opportunity. I moved to the next slide. Short interview clips with 3 families. Their words, their eyes, their backgrounds, all undeniable truths needing no justification. The room fell completely silent. I ended with a question. Who are we building for? The 1% or the 99% left behind? Thomas Nguyen adjusted his glasses and asked, "Do you have long-term support data?" I handed over detailed reports, growth charts, risk assessments of misaligned investments. One board member, Elizabeth Turner, nodded slowly. This strategy deserves serious thought. I glanced at Richard. He said nothing. Just sat, eyes darting between members, trying to read their loyalty. But I knew. The moment I stood to present was the moment he lost the one power he always believed unshakable. Fear. The meeting ended in a strange air. No one said anything harsh, but I saw it clearly. Richard was no longer the sole center of gravity, and I was no longer a shadow. When the meeting ended, people stood up one by one, each chair sliding softly against the floor, creating a hollow sound amidst the luxurious quiet of the boardroom. I remained still, gathering my materials, trying to keep my hands from shaking, not from fear, but to remind myself. I did it. Something in the room had shifted. Those who once nodded politely at Richard now began to glance toward me. Not many, but enough for him to sense the change. Thomas Nguyen, the once silent chairman, walked up to me, placing a hand on my folder. "Excellent report. You should send a digital copy to the full board." It wasn't just a compliment, it was a signal. As I left the room, a few other board members nodded at me. No one made a grand gesture, but in the real estate world, those brief nods carry the weight of silent agreement. I didn't look at Richard, but I could feel his gaze trailing me, like an invisible gravitational pull. He was still seated, no one standing beside him, hands clasped on the table, his eyes darkened, as if recalculating everything from scratch. He didn't lash out. He didn't object. But that silence was his fury compressing itself. Out in the hotel corridor, I saw Vanessa waiting. She didn't ask a thing, just looked at me for a moment and said, "You know what? You just took away the one thing he valued more than power, respect." I said nothing, but inside, I knew she was right. Because real power isn't in titles, it's in who still listens to you, even before you speak. And today, Richard spoke. But no one wanted to listen anymore. As we walked out of the hotel, I glanced back once through the large glass lobby window, reflecting the image of a solitary man standing in the room that once was his domain. The golden light cast his face in a red flush, like a king stripped of his crown without anyone lifting a finger. That night, I didn't go straight home. I drove through Pasadena, along the streets I'd once surveyed, past homes with kitchen lights flickering, where ordinary people were making dinner, living real lives. And I thought, if I had spoken up, for them, for the company, for myself, then I had to be ready for what came next. Because I knew. Richard wouldn't stay silent for long. That night, when I returned home, San Marino was unusually cold. Wind from the San Gabriel Mountains rustled through the roadside trees, making the porch light sway in tired intervals. The house was dark. No TV sounds, no scent of food, no clatter of my mother in the kitchen like every evening. Just the yellow light of the living room, and Richard's voice, molten and metallic. "Back already?" I stepped in. He sat slumped in the armchair, white shirt rumpled, tie loose, a near-empty bottle of whiskey lying on the table. My mother stood in the kitchen corner, still holding a dish towel, but she wasn't cleaning anymore, just frozen like a shadow. I carefully set my bag down, about to head upstairs, when Richard spoke again, this time clearer, heavier. "You feel proud of yourself, don't you? For betraying this family." I turned around, keeping my voice calm. I didn't betray anyone. I did what was right. He stood up. The table tipped and crashed to the floor, the bottle rolling toward my feet. His eyes were bloodshot, not just from alcohol, but from the sense of lost control. Richard Hale wasn't used to losing, and he especially wasn't used to losing to a woman, in his own family. "Who do you think you are?" he growled, each word slicing through the air. "You think you can stand above me at work, in this house, in the very home I built with my blood?" My mother stepped forward, trembling. "Richard, stop. She didn't do anything wrong." "Shut up!" he shouted, loud enough to make the glasses on the shelf tremble. "You always defend her. Have you forgotten who paid for this house?" I looked at my mother. She was crying, but no tears fell. Her eyes were red and glistening, but she didn't blink, as if closing her eyes would unleash the storm. I took a deep breath, slowly. "I don't need this house. I don't need your approval, but you don't have the right to threaten my mother." He stepped forward, the space between us just a few strides. That house no longer felt like the one I grew up in. It had become a battlefield, and despite everything I had prepared for, I couldn't predict what would happen next. The air in the living room thickened, as if someone had shattered an invisible bottle full of smoke. I stood still, spine straight, but my hand clenched the edge of my skirt, my heart thudding in rapid bursts. Richard stared at me without blinking, his eyes no longer angry, but hollow, as if he no longer saw me as a person. Then suddenly, he lunged. Everything happened in less than 2 seconds, but in my mind, time slowed like a scene in slow motion. I barely managed to step back before his hand came down, a slap that struck like thunder. The force knocked me off balance. My heel slipped on the wood floor and I fell back, my spine slamming into the corner of the coffee table. A dry crack echoed. Not from the table, but from my own body. Pain shot through like a cold electric current, spreading from shoulder down my back. I tried to get up, but my left wrist was limp, and my shoulder was numb. My mother screamed, "Richard! Oh my God, what are you doing?" But she didn't run to me. She froze in the hallway, like a child caught between a scream and misplaced loyalty. Richard took a few steps back, his eyes still vacant. Then, suddenly he grabbed the whiskey bottle from the floor, swung it. It smashed against the table edge, shards flying, brownish-red liquid splashing. He raised the jagged glass, staggering, voice hoarse. "I'll teach you what respect means. In my house, no one defies me." I scrambled backward, my right hand reaching for the phone in my coat pocket. My fingers were numb from the fall, but I managed to dial the familiar numbers. 911. The dispatcher's voice came through. I whispered, broken words. "San Marino, 235 Westfield Drive. Need police. Urgent. Domestic violence. Weapon involved." Richard heard. He roared again and took a step toward me. But in that moment, my mother threw herself in front of him. "Enough! Stop it!" she shouted. For the first time in years, Richard froze. He had never seen her like that. I seized the moment, crawled out of the room, back screaming in pain, my arm nearly numb. I locked myself in the study, sank to the floor, clutching my shoulder with the one arm still working, hearing nothing but the pounding of my heart. Outside, Richard's voice still rang, but no longer clearly. Everything began to blur. The smell of whiskey, the tang of blood, the burnt wood from floor scuffs, all merging into a memory I knew would never leave me. The first siren wailed as I lay motionless on the floor of the study, my back propped against a filing cabinet, my left shoulder swollen as if someone had stuffed ice between each nerve. Outside, I heard my mother scream something, but my ears had gone numb, like a pane of glass had sealed me off from the world. Then came the heavy stomps down the hallway. The front door burst open. "San Marino PD, drop the weapon, hands in the air." A mix of shouting and clattering followed, chairs tipping over, metal hitting the hard floor. Probably the broken bottle Richard still held in his hand. I heard him yelling, "I didn't do anything! She's making it up!" but then came the distinct sound of handcuffs clicking, a pained groan, and the officer's firm voice. "You are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon. Anything you say can be used against you in court." When the door to the study opened, a flashlight beam hit my face. A young female officer knelt beside me, her voice quick but gentle. "What's your name?" I answered, "Natalie Carter." My voice was hoarse but clear. "We're taking you to the hospital now. Can you stand?" I nodded slightly, but as she helped me up, my left leg gave out. A wave of dizziness crashed over me like a tide. The officer signaled and 2 paramedics entered. Within minutes, they strapped me onto a stretcher, secured my shoulder with a brace, and began checking my injuries. As they wheeled me out of the house, I saw my mother sitting collapsed on the steps, hands clutching her head, her whole body trembling. Her face was soaked with tears, her eyes wild as though she'd just woken from a 20-year-long nightmare. She tried to follow me, but her legs gave way and a medic gently held her back. "We'll update you on her condition as soon as possible." I looked at her, without blame, without anger, just a silent gaze, as if speaking the words she hadn't yet admitted. That silence, when stretched too long, becomes complicity. The ambulance raced into the night, its siren echoing through the quiet streets of San Marino. I lay there, watching the ceiling lights shudder with each jolt, the scent of antiseptic and gauze sharp in my nose. One paramedic asked, "Where does it hurt?" I whispered, "My shoulder." "And here." I pointed to my chest. There was no wound there, but I knew that's where it hurt the most, and there was no bandage that could cover it. I woke up at 4 a.m. in Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The room was so white it felt cold, the smell of disinfectant circling my nose like I was lying in a sterile pod somewhere in space. My left arm was in a sling, my shoulder fixed in a black brace, aching like a fracture whispering through each breath. Outside the glass window, dawn hadn't broken yet, just the amber glow of street lamps spilling across the parking lot, painting tired shadows. My mother sat in the corner, clutching a paper coffee cup gone cold. She was still wearing the same wrinkled cardigan, her hair loose and her eyes no longer hiding. When I opened mine, she stood, walked over. "Does it hurt?" Her voice trembled, but for the first time it didn't dodge. I nodded slightly, eyes fixed on her. "The police, they want to speak with you," she said, head lowered. I knew, and I knew I had a choice to make. A while later, the lead officer on the case entered, a middle-aged man with a nameplate reading Detective Palmer. He placed a file on the table, pulled up a chair, his gaze steady, not judging. "Ms. Carter," he began, "we've collected statements from your mother, the emergency team, and the arresting officers. We also have the 911 call recording and security footage documenting Mr. Hale's actions." He paused, then said, "We need to know. Do you wish to press charges?" The room fell silent. For a moment, I heard the clink of metal tools from the nearby tray, the soft drip of the IV, and the pounding of my own heart like a drumbeat. I closed my eyes. I saw my mother, shaking between 2 men, one controlling, one silent. I saw Vanessa, who safeguarded my evidence, stayed quiet when I needed her to. I saw the woman in the interview video, who once said, "I just want a safe home for my kids to grow up in." And I saw myself, at 12 years old, hiding by the staircase, listening to Richard scream at my mother, too scared to breathe. I opened my eyes, then nodded, slowly, clearly, without blinking. "I will press charges." Not because I wanted to destroy a man, but because I refused to let the past repeat itself. Not just for me, but for my mother, for all the women who were ever forced to call silence stability. Detective Palmer made a note, then closed the file. "You've done the right thing." When he left, my mother stepped forward and took my right hand, the only one uninjured. She didn't say sorry. She just cried, for the first time, like someone who had realized that prolonged compromise is a form of loss. I gently squeezed her hand, and for the first time in years, I felt my shoulders lighten, not because of painkillers, but because I knew I was no longer a bystander in my own story. I had chosen not to be silent. And that was where healing begins. 8 weeks after the assault, the official trial opened at Stanley Mosque Courthouse, the Central Court of Los Angeles. That day, the sky was a solid gray, not a ray of sun in sight. The granite steps leading into the courthouse felt longer than usual, scattered with reporters scribbling in low murmurs. The incident hadn't made major headlines, but the name Richard Hale, longtime CEO of a real estate empire, carried enough weight to draw attention. I entered courtroom 314, dressed in a plain black suit, my left shoulder still lightly braced under my coat, a reminder that not all wounds had healed, not physically, not emotionally. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the clerk's pen tapping against her pad. On the defendant's side, Richard sat with his head lowered, his light gray suit neatly pressed, but his face no longer bore the familiar authority. His hands were clasped before him, occasionally twitching in barely controlled tremors. His lawyer stood and delivered an opening statement, voice smooth, clearly rehearsed hundreds of times. "Your Honor, Mr. Hale is the victim of a momentary lapse of judgment while under the influence. There was no intention to cause serious harm. This is his first such offense, and we ask the court to consider his decades of contribution to the real estate sector." I didn't flinch, because I knew violence is never a first time. It is the outcome of years of being covered up, tolerated, rationalized by status and reputation. Then it was my turn. My attorney called me to the witness stand. I looked around the room, the jury, the judge, the public, and my mother sitting in the front row. I began to speak, from the beginning. No embellishments, no dramatization. I spoke of that night, the sound of the bottle breaking, the pounding in my chest as I backed away, the wrenching snap in my shoulder, and the paralyzing fear when my mother didn't dare come near. I spoke of growing up in a house where power was law, silence was a weapon, and family love was bound in phrases like, "Family means knowing your place." When I finished, no one applauded, but it wasn't needed, because in that moment, the courtroom felt like a chapel. Then the lawyer said, "We call our final witness, Mrs. Margaret Carter." All heads turned. My mother stood, took slow steps to the stand. She wore a soft gray-blue cardigan, not striking, but she stood tall, her eyes unflinching. When asked, "Have you ever witnessed Mr. Hale behave violently before?" she swallowed hard, then said, "Yes." One word, but inside that word was a lifetime. She continued, voice slow, slightly shaking but steady. "I've been silent for too long. This time my daughter did not stay silent, and neither will I." I looked at her. We didn't touch. But in that moment, I knew. We had stepped through a door, and there was no going back. The trial extended for 3 more days, with evidence, testimonies, and the recordings I had submitted earlier, played in the thick silence of the courtroom. The 911 call, my voice trembling. "My stepfather. He's holding a piece of glass. He pushed me down. I can't move." My shoulder was played before the full jury. As it echoed through the room, Richard lowered his head. For the first time, he didn't look up. Over the years I worked under him, I'd seen him shout at employees, explode over lost deals, use contempt to silence people. But I had never seen him quiet. On sentencing day, I arrived early. No makeup. I didn't need to appear strong anymore. I was strong. The court found Richard Hale guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, with intent and bodily harm. Sentence: 6 years in prison, with no parole. He was also removed from his role as CEO, and all executive powers were suspended by the company. News broke fast. One headline the next morning read, Richard Hale removed following domestic violence charges. Whistleblower is stepdaughter. I didn't care about headlines. I only remembered his eyes when he was escorted out. Not angry, not fighting, just hollow. A man who once controlled everything, now unable to control the consequences. As I stepped outside the courthouse, the Los Angeles sun bathed the granite steps. I inhaled deeply. My shoulder still ached, but my footsteps no longer felt heavy. My mother walked a few paces behind me. She said nothing. We simply walked side by side, like two people returning from the same war. No longer hiding, no longer playing roles. On the way home, my phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. Proud of you. And everyone in that room felt it. I smiled, not a radiant smile, but the kind only those who've survived violence understand. A quiet exhale, like wind across a scar that's still healing. And I knew. I had just walked out of the invisible prison that held me for years. Not a prison of bars and stone, but one built from a single word: endurance. And today, I was free. 1 month after the trial, I moved back into my apartment in Old Town Pasadena, vacant for 3 months during renovation, but now, like myself, stripped down, reinforced, rebuilt. It was no longer a temporary refuge, it was home. I chose new ivory curtains to let the morning light in freely. The ficus tree in the corner, which I thought had died, had sprouted new leaves, tender, green, undeniable. Each morning, I brewed coffee, not for caffeine, but for the soft hum of the machine, the scent that filled the kitchen, reminding me that I was here, fully present. I returned to work in a new role, Deputy Director of Business Development at LA headquarters, following company restructuring. People called me the woman who said no to power, but I didn't want that title. I just wanted to work with honest numbers, real needs, and people who weren't forgotten in annual plans. And I did. The mid-range housing project I defended was officially launched in Riverside. My team doubled in size, and Vanessa was the first person I kept. She entered my new office on day 1, laughing. Deputy Director now, and you still have this tiny cactus? I answered, it survived. So did I. We both laughed. As for my mother, she began therapy. A San Marino women's group of domestic violence survivors helped her realize she wasn't alone. In the first week, she didn't speak, just listened. By the third, she wrote a letter to the group, sharing that the hardest forgiveness is forgiving yourself. When I visited, she no longer wore silence like a mask. She told me about dreams, memories, and the things she once silenced, believing it was the price of stability. There was no dramatic reconciliation, just quiet weekend conversations when she asked, "Did you sleep enough this week?" And I nodded, then poured more tea. The air between us no longer felt like a violin string about to snap. It softened, like a strand of yarn gently unraveled from a tangle. Slowly, but truly. 1 year after the trial, I launched Break Free California, a legal and psychological aid fund for women in real estate who face abuse or power manipulation at work or home. The first office was on the 3rd floor of a modest Pasadena building. No flashy signs, no bright colors. Just a simple white plaque that read, "A place where you don't have to be silent to be respected." On opening day, there were no red ribbons, no confetti, but over 60 people showed up. Mostly women. Some were admin staff, some executives. One was a recent graduate, with her mother. I stepped to the podium, note cards in hand, but didn't use them. I looked at the crowd and began telling my story. Not from the fall, but from the moment I stood back up. We're taught to endure. At home, to be silent for peace. At work, to defer to avoid trouble. But what I've learned is this. Violence doesn't always scream. It can hide in polite smiles, in sarcasm during meetings, or a glance that makes you shrink. I paused, then looked at the front row where my mother sat, hands clasped. And one day, I no longer wanted to shrink. The room went silent, but not with discomfort, with recognition. Because in that room, I wasn't the only one who had lived in the dark. I was just the first to switch on the light. After the speech, an elderly woman approached, took my hand, voice trembling. "Thank you for for helping my granddaughter believe she has the right to say no." I nodded, not because I had done something grand, but because I knew big change starts with small acts. A sentence, a report, a moment of truth in a boardroom, a single 911 call. 1 week later, I woke up on a Sunday morning, autumn sun spilling through the apartment window. I stepped onto the balcony with coffee in hand. The scent of coffee and the chirping of sparrows from the next rooftop blended, not loud, but alive. I looked out toward the San Gabriel Mountains, fading in mist, and I knew I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And more than that, I was someone who changed the game. If you've stayed with me this far, perhaps my story touched a corner of your memory or your heart. Maybe you've never called 911, never stood in court, but I believe we've all felt what it's like to shrink, just to stay safe. But the truth is, silence doesn't keep peace. It only gives more space to the one who controls. And sometimes, the bravest act isn't loud defiance, but a quiet no, a steady gaze, a step out of the door that's held you too long. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below. You don't need to share details, just a single dot if you know that feeling. And if you believe that a woman's value lies not in what she endures, but in the voice she owns, click like and subscribe. Because here, we tell the stories they once said, "Don't speak," but we speak, and we are never alone.